So, Professor Soulez, I think we are ready to start. First, I will introduce you in Russian, and then you will proceed with your talk. Okay?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Всем добрый день. Сегодня мы продолжаем уже третий день нашей секции. И открываем мы этот день с доклада Антонии Soulez Understanding like composing, в котором она попробует противопоставить понимание Мерло-Понти и Гилберта Райла. So I think Professor Soulez, you can start.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, hello. I hope you will understand me easily. I am speaking in English. I am French, but I will try to do my best. So I will first, as I have been asked to do, present the opposition, the conflict between phenomenology and analytical philosophy, which, in my opinion, according to me, is more or less worn out today. Today, we deal with other subject matters, but it's necessary to make a short return at the time when the philosophers on each side, on each camp, used to oppose their methodological tools and conceptions. That was in 1950s, a very important date. Around the end of the 50s in France, a colloquium took place in France in a Royaumont Center on philosophy analytique, analytical philosophy. It gathered phenomenologues and analytical philosophers invited in person for the first, an exceptional opportunity for such living representatives as there was Merleau-Ponty present in discussion, and at the opposite side, but many others, of course, also Gilbert Ryle, for instance, from the Cambridge University, and there were two main figures to oppose their respective views. At that time, their philosophical views, and that's interesting, I think, were very distant from each other, almost like foreign languages, which means that you can speak different languages in philosophy. There is not one universal language. And the philosophical view were indeed very distant from each other, almost like two foreign languages, as I said. You're struck when you see the analytical on the side of analytical philosophy, you're struck also by different voices. There are different schools among the analytical. They were not just one and the same, representing different positions. You find Quine, Strawson, Ayer, Sir Alfred Ayer, G.L. Austin, and very, very different analytical philosophers. So it meant already different schools covering different methods of analysis. In fact, analysis had not just one meaning. And maybe on the phenomenological side, there was more homogeneity on the so-called continental side. Gilbert Ryle presents la phénoménologie, his phenomenological conception, the concept of mind. So he presents how he received what he thinks about the opposite side among the phenomenologies. that is his access to the presentation of his own concept of mind. This phenomenology was the opponent of analytical philosophy. One could say the contrary and consider that the analytical is rather the target of phenomenologies. Anyway, it was a kind of war. Yet the tonality is rather than of an attempt to meet in spite of differences on important subjects like the mind, which has, of course, different meanings in that debate. There is not one meaning of the mind. And there is still the possibility of agreeing, especially on such a common question, which is measure. Ryle exposed a theory of concepts developed by Russell and immediately points out the anti-Platonist conception of concepts in the light of modern logic of quantification founded early century by Frege-Russell, called the Frege-Russell analysis. He knows well the matter as a distinguished philologist. He has thoroughly worked on Plato's Sophistes and other Middle dialects on language, namely on letters and syllables, as the Greek alphabetic paradigm excellence of analysis of meaning was the alphabetic, yet in a modernized reformulation of analysis. And so he suggested to superimpose Frege-Russell method of analysis of meaning and read Sophists of Plato with the help of that modern reconstructed modern paradigm. So, of course, there is no place in the Frege-Russellian model for a separated Platonist universal. That would be the essence, so-called essence or meaning of a concept. Meaning is what is common to all complete expressions, as he says, that express the same thing when the rest varies. As such, meaning is not a Platonic entity, it is abstractible. So that was the scope, the portée, important portée of the new paradigm of analysis that was to be compared, to Plato's. No problem of evaluation whether Plato is better than Frege-Russell or Frege-Russell better than Plato. In fact, Ryle considered that Plato had lots to say in the modern, for the modern of his time, and that he could have been Plato himself, a second Plato, and he did not consider that there was a hierarchy between the two paradigms. There were just two foreign paradigms, there were two foreign languages, and there were different methodology of analysis of meaning that could be compared, but not reduced each to the other. What is interesting in the context of Gilbert Ryle's presentation is the way he opposes Husserl and Wittgenstein, and this is the point to which I want to arrive on these matters, both conscious of the importance, Husserl and Wittgenstein, of the importance of the rule of logical grammar. Yet Wittgenstein, that he was dead at the time of this Royaumont encounter, has insisted on observing users, very important word, users, rather than legitimate rules for meaning in the light of a superior essence. That was Husserl's conception. Namely, Wittgenstein has shown that one cannot define the essence of logical expressions of constant or logical connective, such as or, and, all, some, not, etc. There is no possibility of saying about what these logical terms stand for, what they express. This point, which expresses in the Tractatus a main objection to Russell's conception of logical form, has been read as being rather close to Merleau-Ponty's notion of anonymous subject of perception in an article published in the International Review of Philosophy 1969, and then I would refer to Jules Vuillemin. Conceptual researchers are not, and this is important, that's the point, conceptual researchers like Riles or people who have been who have worked in the Frege-Russellian conception of logic are not description of essences. That's very, very important. All description of a concept would finish in stammering. That's why Wittgenstein dropped the idea of describing objects, between brackets, and shows the expression of elucidation of thought with determination of the limits of expressibility. As regards the verb, Aristotle showed the way to look at concepts as hexes, as he said in Greek, or dispositional, as opposed to action, but not as acts of describing essence behind such words. As well known, Aristotle was very welcome and still now among the English philosophers. So the English philosopher would rather choose Plato instead of Aristotle. We say that Aristotle est chez les Anglais. He lives in England, you know, English philosophers favored Aristotle rather than Plato. Ryle was an exception to be so interested in Plato's matters, because he wanted to compare, as I said, the paradigm of method of analysis were so far from each other. However, Merleau-Ponty notes that both Wittgenstein and Husserl are looking towards what you say, capturing the living force of what we are seeing in fact. Very important point, capturing the living force of what we are saying in fact. The idea of an exact account of what is meaning, as in a scientific approach, is one thing that the English philosopher didn't look for. The elucidation of ordinary concept, another one. Austin, for instance, represented that elucidation of ordinary concepts. The name of Carnap at the time, in exile in the United States, means another conception of analysis that is hardly mentioned in the proceedings. So now, second part, back to Husserl and Carnap, approach text to text. That's now. Less than 20 years later, after Royaumont intellectual event, I remind you, 1950s, at the end of 50s, 59, at a time when philosophy of mind becomes a main trend in the United States, a broad controversy burst out throughout the continent between two main currents, represented by here von Richt, great reader of Wittgenstein, coming from the Finnish school, Helsinki, author of Explaining and Understanding, London 1971, on one side, and in front, Carl Otto Appel, who wrote a book exactly the reverse of the title of von Richt, on understanding and explaining in the methodology of what they called Geisteswissenschaften, 1979, Geisteswissenschaften being les sciences de l'esprit, that were called moral sciences by Hume, you know, that were conflictual methodology of dealing with language when you look for unity of language. On one side, Geisteswissenschaft, on the other side, Naturwissenschaften. As is noticeable, the titles are, as I said, inverted. The evaluation lies in the face of Geisteswissenschaft about which paradigm is best to explain meaning or understanding. That's Apple side. Explication, on the contrary, mean on the model of natural sciences or understanding language as system of science, as Peirce said, in the transcendental, this is what Apple claimed, in the transcendental light of self-reflexivity of reason. Which current is to absorb the other? Von Richt on one side, in favor of explication on the model of science, or Apple on understanding in the transcendental sense of self-reflexivity of reason, either the natural sciences or the moral sciences. That was a question. And in the 80s, in France, it looked like a war between which a philosopher of the time had to choose. I remember myself having to choose. And I was rather discovering Wittgenstein, Carnap, the Vienna Circle, and I was rather interested. I had not decided yet, but I think that I was reluctant to endorse Apple's side. I was rather on the evolving in Wittgenstein matters more willingly, and especially the second Wittgenstein, the second and the third, but I will perhaps say a word about it. However, and since that time, a renewed textual approach to the initiators of the dilemma between the two camps that turned into a rather ideological conflict within European philosophy, from Germany to the West, seems now to impose itself. Looking back to the text, standing in front of each other, so I have a textual approach, and that's very important. Two main figures appear in the background, who inaugurated much earlier a rigorous method of constituting the world. That expression, very, very a key expression, as Husserl and Carnap in opposition, but each one would talk about constituting the world at approximately the same period of time and conception. Two German philosophers note, not one in the continent and the other overseas, but two German philosophers, both in Europe and apparently not in conflict at all with each other, although they did disagree. Attracted by the same Vienna as a pole of discussion and encounter, Husserl once applied to teach in Vienna, and he failed. Whereas Carnap, who left Germany because it was not possible any longer to work in Germany in that time, in 1922, metaphysics by logical analysis, overcoming metaphysics by logical analysis. Logical analysis was the new logic, Frege-Russellian. Among them, there was Schlick, well known for his critique of Husserl's Materiales a priori, and Neurath, who did not hide his allergy against the phenomenological or hermeneutical sense. Husserl and Carnap. To put it briefly, we have here a method for description of the essences through what Husserl called Wesenschau, intuition of essences, and in contrast, as presented in the Aufbau, that's Carnap, Berlin 1928, a method for reconstructing the concept of the language of knowledge in a hierarchy of levels, branch by branch, from empirical sciences up to moral sciences, or Geisteswissenschaften, that would cancel the expression, on the model of Russell's theory of types. And that's the new logic requirement. This latter construction differs completely from a transcendental constitution. So there was a disagreement about the meaning of constitution in Husserl's approach and in Carnap's approach, but they would almost use the same expression, very close to each other, but meaning opposite methods of constitution, that is, making the world, but in what sense? So the same expression, constitution, would refer to alternative projects of erecting, of edifying a language for the world, or a language in the Carnap approach sense, formalized language in Carnap sense, but the world as it is given in a phenomenological sense in Husserl's approach. That's not at all the same constitution. It offers a clear, in the case of Carnap, a clear naturalistic option. It's Naturwissenschaften conception in favor of expressing formally psychological and social science expressions in terms of empirical science on a unified basis. But when somebody says unified, it means you have to choose one and unique idiom that is a formal mode of expression. That's not at all Husserl's view. Today, a new generation of philosophers in France are working on these two approaches, which I find is very meaningful. Young researchers, they take it again, they are discussing again on the textual approach between Husserl and Carnap in the Sorbonne. I'm invited on the 13th of May to discuss with them, still on this problem, Here Husserl, there on Carnap. What Husserl wanted to elicit, what Carnap in counterpart wished to obtain, that Husserl failed to build up, constitute with concept. What meaning give to concept in that way? What Carnap in particular owe or not to Husserl? So you see, you take two figures very close to each other with very different languages. Each one talks about expressing, expressing essences, describing essences, and on the other side, expressing formally with the tools of the new logic, Russell, Frege and Russell, tools of analysis of meaning. Something they call each other, together, both, the monde, le monde, the world, yes. Back to text to text, what is remarkable is the role of language. In fact, language has not the same meaning. The way it is treated makes a difference between two philosophical methods. You have one word for two philosophical methods. Concept owed to language for expressing essence is one thing, whereas on the opposite side, expressing essences is absolutely rejected. Rational reconstruction, according to Carnap, indeed, requires a different treatment of language, not an expressive tool coming orientated down, up towards essences, that's expression in a literary conception, you express something that waits to be expressed, which is not expressed until now, but a symbolism showing objects as ordered structures of relations, in other terms, formalized concepts. Following the Tractatus, that's, of course, what Wittgenstein brought to this analytical philosophy at its beginning. The procedure of logical representation projects functional relations up, down, in the opposite direction to expression. Logical representation is Abbildung. That is Abbildung, projection, from up to down, not expressing from down to up, And orientation. View. A new term then appears in phenomenology initiated in France by Merleau-Ponty with the introduction of language in the field of phenomenology. Husserl is considered as having failed to having said something interesting about language in the field of phenomenology. He missed the interesting articulation of phenomenology with language. This is what Merleau-Ponty thinks. What is interesting is that the thematic of language could not go without a re-evaluation of Husserl's expressing so-called essences. So Merleau-Ponty, of course, introduces a critique of expressing essences, a re-evaluation of that. Back to essence, in new ways, is Merleau-Ponty move. The point of view is that of a sujet parlant. Never Husserl would have talked about a sujet parlant. Yes, a subject, a speaking subject, natively immersed in language. As a linguistic milieu or surrounding environment, the cogito is not a separate substance from things and activities in the world. It is surrounded with language. In fact, it's not exactly a linguistic cogito because it is anti-predicative. But being surrounded with language, you cannot consider that it is separated from linguistic items and from things and activity, as Descartes thought, and Husserl after him. Then things are not objects built or pre-existing above reality. That's Merleau-Ponty's point. This marked the end of the Cartesian ideal foundation of scientific thought that Husserl wanted to radicalize in his meditation Cartesian meditation. Turning his back against the Husserlian investigation into meaning in the framework of mathematical idealities that stem from Descartes, Merleau-Ponty renounces Husserl's project of constituting the world in terms of foundation. That important word is foundation, in favor of a descriptive phenomenology of perception, in which meaning is a process expressed through gestures toward things in order to incorporate their modality of being at the level of a so-called subject, sujet parlant. Attends, tu vas trop vite, là. Non, mais je sais plus ce qui est au-dessus. In fact, the less subjective as possible, understood as an anonymous subjectivity of the perceived. That's Merleau-Ponty expression about the subject. The subject, phenomenological appraised is a reduced subject that is not personal. It's not an ego. It becomes anonymous in the sense of it is not me. Yes, it's a subjectivity in general at the level of phenomenon, at the level of perception. That's la phénoménologie de la perception, which is Merleau-Ponty main work. What motivates this inquiry is my relation, but not my as a personal subject, to the thing, my tendency to respond to its being in the field of perception. Like, for instance, the essence of this sound, yes, I make one with by assimilation, a sound. I hear a melody, I am interested in a certain sound, yes, and this sound, I am so captivated by this essence that I try to identify myself with this essence, so that I must lose my status of personal ego to interiorize this essence of this sound. And this is by a gesture, yes, a virtual gesture toward the thing which is in the same world as myself, not separated. Far from the aim of foundation. So in fact, Merleau-Ponty turns his back against foundation, Husserl's foundations, meaning express a different instituted ways. That institution, there is an interesting investigation by Merleau-Ponty of the articulation between institution and meanings. The different instituted ways signifiers make up the expressed entity as a result or a fruit of gesturing toward things in use without looking for, as Descartes or Husserl, for certainty nor completeness. Meaning and institution are thereby codependent through use within the world that, and that's an interesting expression, I hope I make you understand the double meaning, that comprises me. Comprise is understand, but in the sense of englober, put together, things put together. I'm not a subject in front of objects in a world. I tend to understand as objectively as possible, so that there is a subject here, an object in front, and then the subject tries to understand the object as being on the other side. That's understand. In French, Merleau-Ponty writes, it's not that I want to mean. The word me comprend. It means comprises me, yes. I am within the world. I am in relation to it intrinsically. So it's the world which understands me, yes, in the sense of comprising, embracing, yes. So there are two opposite senses, of course, of understanding. It's not objective understanding like Husserl want to do vis-à-vis the world as a successor of Descartes. It is that the world comprises me before I try to understand it objectively. So that's really Merleau-Ponty, yes. I am comprised, I am embraced by the world, and understanding objectively is just in vain, you know. I miss something about the world when I do that. One cannot read such a stance without thinking of Wittgenstein, so-called immanence of grammar. So there are some converging points between Wittgenstein and Merleau-Ponty, which have been sometimes mentioned. At times, you know, there is no systematic reflection of Wittgenstein and Merleau-Ponty, but there is much to say, you know, on a third position, which is not explaining, not understanding in the traditional sense that I have exposed at the beginning. So playing on the French word comprendre now suggests a method of understanding in the sense, the third sense I was trying here to formulate. In the sense I am, you know, the world comprises me first. Back to Descartes, uncertain subject. That's just an idea I have, which I think is lively and makes you imagine what I want to say. In the meditation Cartesian, you have the two first meditations. The first meditation is normally read in function of the second. The cogito takes form, you know, is shaped in the second meditation. So the reader usually forget the first meditation. And that's perhaps a pity, because in the first meditation, you have a Cartesian interesting standpoint, which should not remain as such on the subject, let's say, uncertainty. I start to be a subject of uncertainty, but I shouldn't say I. Something start to be uncertain before the cogito reveals itself. And that's not even a subject. You know, the word subjects is too much. It appears before the logical thought experience. The English consider that the second meditation is a kind of logical experience, you know, a thought experience, which is not untrue, you know, you could perhaps say so, leads to ascertain the cogito as a self-subsisting entity. The tense is therefore antepredicative, as we say. I like to imagine that, after all, Merleau-Ponty could have simulated a return to Descartes' subject of uncertainty, as figured out in the first meditation, before the cogito, you know, well known in the history of thought as cogito, is found. In other terms, I follow Merleau-Ponty's attempt to plunge again in the uncertainties of what Merleau-Ponty calls the vibrating contingency, which is a way of talking about the world as it is, visualize Descartes' own comparison, looking for itself, the subject, not yet a nameable subject, find itself immersed in deep water. It is a sort of floating that in shows, something not nameable in terms of subject, that does not touch the bottom, the soil at the bottom, and whose head does not either emerge out of the water. You are floating in between. This floating uncertain entity, not yet a subject, is that, not the who, the that claimed by Nietzsche, and also Ernst Mach, a matter for the ça. It thinks instead of I, and that will be mentioned by Freud, you know, who read so well Ernst Mach, le ça. Now, the project that Husserl in the meditation, Cartesian Meditations, 1929, translated by Levinas, caressed in order to so-called constitute the world, or the pure act of founding, reveals itself to be an illusion that Merleau-Ponty denounces in his Phenomenology of Perception, considering that this act of foundation, articulated with the goal of capturing objectivity of essence as visée, is too ambitious, and even a kind of hallucination. He uses the word of the psychiatry of his time to talk about hallucination. That means being obsessively fixed on objects as such, since we are, on the contrary, deeply entangled in our relation to things in this contingent, vibrating world. A beautiful analysis of this entanglement is given on the mode of what he calls chiasma relation, ignoring the separation between subject and object, showing how touching is intricated together with the thing touched, smelling with the perfume smelled, hearing this sound with the sound heard, and this chiasmatic relation resists analyticity in all senses of the word, not only a positivistic Carnapian one, but also Husserl's so-called quasi-experience. That implies two renouncings, and not only one. First, founding the sciences, but also the analysis of intentionality inherited from Brentano, of the consciousness orientated towards the idea of science, the pure idea of science, along the transcendental kind of life that is implied as a visée, or, to say it simply, directedness of intention in the meaning activity aiming at things themselves. That's Husserl. Fourth part, ways of what we could call embodied cognition. Merleau-Ponty with Wittgenstein. Understanding as composing, this is my title, is now the conception I intend to develop as the phenomenon of embodied cognition. It is tentative, you will excuse me for that attempt and temptation to present things. I am interested in what is called Dichtung, which is composing in German. Normally, Dichtung is used for poetry. The Dichtung is a Dichtung of poetical expression. But Wittgenstein was not gifted for poetry, as he avows it. He says, I am unable of poetry. Distant for me is to compose language games. A very interesting activity in philosophy. To make philosophy should be, he says in Vermischten Bemerkungen, which is Culture and Value in English, 1931, should be nur dichten. That's an expression that needs to be investigated. Why nur? Only. Dichten, that is not more than dichten, but what is dichten? So dichten refers to understanding, and it implies elucidation, because Wittgenstein has never forgotten that he wanted to elucidate expressibility of thought, elucidation of science. I can recognize as being mine, yours, common to a community of language. That means socially shared, and out of which I am also unable to create new meanings. To be able to create new meanings is where main claim that deals with the living force of saying that we have noticed further above. Valéry as a model for making clear that sort, or that third understanding of understanding, when he describes in one of his cahiers, beautiful Greek column he's contemplating, and says that looking at it with admiration makes him share its beauty as if he was its creator through a kind of virtual simulation with gestures. He uses the word gesture, and I think that, of course, Merleau-Ponty, who used to read Valéry and made conferences of Collège de France on Valéry notes, used the expression by Valéry, what had a lot of views in common. Among opponents discussing about language, all agree, as I said, that is a common view on the importance of the, I said, living force of saying as an act. Ryle, Merleau-Ponty, but also Wittgenstein and Valéry. This living force appears in the capacity of, into brackets, creating new meanings with old expression that is already used tools, that mean also institutionally recognized. Both analytical philosophers and phenomenologists insist on such a capacity. That's understanding as creating new forms and gestures out of used entities. Music might help to capture some important features of understanding as composition. Philosophers who have contributed to define understanding as a composition make a family of thinkers: Merleau-Ponty, Valéry, Wittgenstein, and in a lesser measure, perhaps Musil. I will not talk about music today. There are many, many things to say also on that question of music, but it's too much. In reference to understanding music, we find parallel views between Adorno and Wittgenstein, Adorno being the Frankfurt School dialectical inspired with Marx. So very different. That's not that. So I would not put Adorno in the family of thinkers of understanding as composition, although he brings an interesting argument in favor of that view. There are, but I will not go very far, just consider the affinities between understanding a phrase in language, understanding a musical phrase. So the question is affinities between two sorts of understanding. It's not an affinity between grossly said language here and music there. That's not interesting. It's false anyway, yes? But understanding a phrase in language has affinities with understanding a musical phrase. So the stress is on understanding, not on music or language. It's just that music has something to learn us about what is understanding in the third sense I want to develop. Wittgenstein wonders what it is that happens during the time I am hearing a melody in concomitance with hearing, not a what I am understanding. The question of what is not good, but how? A kind of accentuated process with aspectual features of a motto, variation from a thema that seems given as a fixed paradigm, but in fact is not the same, but always other than itself. You could say that music is alteration. Yes, there is a book, a famous book which is called Music as Alteration. The result is generating new gestures or form that I make mine. That's the interiorization. They penetrate into myself as I am impressed by the effect of their pregnant and rhythmic aspect. On his side, in turn, Adorno writes. So it's quite close, although the reasoning is completely different. Understanding is make one's own the tendencies of the sound material through a joint process of desubjectivization and désobjectivization also. In his final chapter final, vers une musique informelle, towards informal music, 1961, you find it in Quasi una Fantasia. Adorno explains how the compositional ear internalizes what he hears through a kind of perceiving what, in a living contact with the material, has gone out of it. It's a marvelous presentation of the reflexivity in hearing. And so that could be taken as a model for thinking, understanding as that kind of reflexivity, you know, of the ear, the composition ear. The reference he gives to Boulez, just above, tells the reader that this account is that of an active process of listening. The idea of an active listening was Boulez's own one. This schema of dialectical reflexivity, let's forget what dialectic is, in turn, allows an explanation of intellectuality by reflexivity, as in music. Intellectuality through reflexivity is common to philosophy, is music. That's page in my edition, French, Quasi una Fantasia, in this text of 1961. A reference to the Althaus famous statement to grasp the dynamic phenomenon when mastering a language is for the writer called the Dichter, following the way it lets itself be mastered. So there is mastering turning into being mastered. And in French, the translation is maîtriser une langue et suivre la façon dont elle se laisse maîtriser. That's true for music, that's true for writing, prose, yes. Although these activities are totally different in themselves. This reversal of mastering this reversal of mastering into being mastered is a phenomenon of incorporation that allows the act of Deutung, understanding, as an aesthetic interpretation of the Gestalt. That's not at all understanding in the hermeneutical, according to the hermeneutical tradition. That's not at all, for instance, compatible with what the famous Dilthey says. You know, it's very far from the tradition, hermeneutical tradition of understanding. So that's an aesthetic interpretation of the Gestalt that impresses the listener, form, gesture of the musical piece, hence his impulse to respond, that's the important term, to respond by new gesture or forms to the forms by a process of incorporation of objects. I make mine when I try to capture them asubjectively and independently from the formalist or formal diktat of Sachlichkeit, factuality. I have two objections as regards the Merleau-Ponty approach. My argument is that these processes of understanding phrases by making mine the aspects of form, gestalten, of language, as they do in music, exclude the participation of a phenomenological focal consciousness, such as developed by Merleau-Ponty. I have not the time to develop my critique of focal consciousness in phenomenology offered by Merleau-Ponty, but I feel more affinities. I feel indebted to, and I would advise you to read it. Vincent Descombes, Critique of Merleau-Ponty, Objective Spirit in its Institution of Science. So far, I don't agree with Jules Vuillemin, comparison between Wittgenstein critique of the subject with Merleau-Ponty anonymous subject of the perceived. I think there is a reason for, put Merleau-Ponty and Wittgenstein on the same line until a certain extent, until a certain limit, which is what they call subjects. For Wittgenstein, the subject disappears and lets the whole world logical form appear in its place. With Merleau-Ponty, not at all. The subject becomes anonymous, an anonymous subject of the perceived, which is absolutely not the same, I take the comparison as indeed problematic between Wittgenstein and Merleau-Ponty, but never would Wittgenstein endorse Merleau-Ponty's argument in favor of incorporation of the essence of sound, for instance, as this description presupposes the activity of the focal consciousness. I don't agree with that. Wittgenstein's solipsism would reject, according to his critique of the subject. The critique of the subject, metaphysical subject in Wittgenstein word, is completely incompatible with Merleau-Ponty anonymous subjectivity of the perceived. So this is just to say that this is the limit of the comparison between Wittgenstein and Merleau-Ponty. But you can consider that it doesn't matter, that despite this difficulty to make subject clause given of realism, which is solipsism, reducible to Merleau-Ponty subjectivity, that's a limit, yes, but that does not invalidate the idea of incorporation. It constitutes two different arguments in favor of incorporation. I think that Wittgenstein incorporation is very different from Merleau-Ponty in the end. In conclusion, to conclude, my philosophical claim of understanding like composing implies an aesthetic kind of interpretation, deuten, dichten, for the sake of dichten, that contrasts with, on one side, formalism, explaining, deducing, etc., without being reducible to phenomenology in the sense of Husserl, of course, already, and even Merleau-Ponty, in spite of common features. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Soulez. We are ready to move to Q&A session. However, we are very short on time, so I think maybe one or two questions. We will be one or two questions. So if anybody in the audience have a question, yeah. So Professor Soulez, do you hear me? Professor Soulez, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I have actually.
I hear you, but I have difficulty to understand you.
Sorry, can you repeat the? Can you repeat the question? We didn't hear you.
What is your question?
Okay, so my question is, you started with a statement that differences between analytic philosophy and phenomenology is worn out. But if I understand you correctly, you ended up saying that this division is still relevant, because you said that you don't agree with the reconciliation of Merleau-Ponty and Wittgenstein's philosophy. So how, could you please tell a little bit more about that, because I didn't understand you probably. So you started saying that this division is worn out, and then you said at the end of your talk that you still think that there is a crucial differences between phenomenology and analytic philosophy. So
yes, I think I see what you mean. Thank you for your question. It is true that nobody would now in France, for instance, and I think not only in France, consider the conflict between understanding and explaining in terms of von Richt and Karl Otto Appel as relevant today. This is one point. But that does not mean that the alternative between explaining and understanding and this cannot be posed again, reformulated again, which means that in a way, the difficulty has not totally disappeared. That's still a question. So there is no contradiction between saying that the two camps, nobody would talk about it anymore, and see the problem reappear in new terms with the reflection on understanding as being not hermeneutical. So I think that there is, since, for instance, even on comme, yes, an approach to understanding as being more pragmatic, yes. It is in accord with the discussions of today, yes, but that does not mean that we would read again and find a position in ideological conflict, because that was a little ideological at that time, in the 70s, 80s, you had to choose your camp, are you a follower of von Richt? Are you a following of Appel? This was the question in France, in the 70s or 80s. Yeah, it had consequences about how your colleagues could situate you in the debates, you know, at the time. Yes, if you were in the Sorbonne, you would be more on the side of Apple. Yes, and this von Richt take the line of von Richt at that time would represent a risk. Yes, because the first people had not read Wittgenstein enough to know what von Richt could draw from Wittgenstein second. Yes, it was not. It was all a whole, you know, a whole thing to take into account at that time. Things have evolved, you know, especially the discovery of the Nachlass by Wittgenstein, and now what people are able to say about a third, or a second, or a third Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein represents a new conception of understanding. Yes, he said himself that he would never be. People who read him should not read him forgetting that he wanted to be a composer. Yes, so that's very important. Yes, it's a Denkbewegung. Yes, so what it is to be a composer in the field of philosophy? This is my question, and this is on that. This is the way I think there is matter to think again on understanding, and it's endless. You know, of course, you can go back to von Richt and Apple. This is not. I don't say the contrary, but you go back to. It's history of ideas, you know, it is history of theories. It's not research. I make a big difference between what is taught in the university, you know, as an institution, though in France, in the Sorbonne, work on history of thought, you know, of theories with exactitude. That's very good, yes. But you may be able also, and I think it's important, to discuss without sticking to these already formulated theories. And this is what I'm trying to do. The words are still available. Understand is a word in use. Explain also, composing also, these all expressions were very useful. And you cannot avoid them, yes. But what you can do with them is give a new meaning, yes, and open another conception out of institutional readings. You know, you have not only philosophy written, you have philosophy in act. Yes, it is in the making, and this is what I try to contribute to, with a third sense of understanding as composing. Have I answered to your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, so thank you, Professor Soulez. I think we have run out of time, so we have to conclude here. Thank you very much to be here with us today. We are very honored and pleased. So thank you very much one more time. Hope to cooperate in the future. So
yes. Thank you. Thank you. With pleasure. Yeah. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Goodbye, goodbye. Tak, no.
Nikita. Oui, je crois.